All right, guys. So in this video, we're going to walk our way through. Pause, reset. All right, guys. In this video, we're going to walk our way through how to calculate an inflation rate using two different general methods. One is called the GDP deflator, and one is called the CPI. And they are largely very, very similar, but they have slight differences that you need to know and be able to recognize. So the first thing I want to put into your brains is what inflation really is and why calculating inflation is a little bit tricky, right? So inflation is at its heart just a rate of change equation. And hopefully you're fairly familiar with a rate of change equation where we just take a new value and subtract an old value and divide it by the old value. And that gives us the percent change. And in this case, we're looking for the percent change in prices. So we take a new price minus an old price, divide it by the old price, and it tells us the rate of change of price. And that is really simple to do when we're talking about a single item, right? The price of a cell phone. Take the new price minus the old price, divide by the old price, and I get how much the price of a cell phone has changed. But how do I calculate the price of everything in the economy simultaneously? And the answer to that is what we call a price index, which is what the CPI and the GDP deflator ultimately are. So there are a few different price indices or price indexes that are used to make this calculation. One is the GDP deflator, which we've talked about before. The other is called the Consumer Price Index, which specifically measures things that consumers buy. A third common one is called the PPI, the Producer Price Index, which measures the prices that producers are paying for things. And this is one way, as a side note, that the government checks its own work, because if producers are paying more for things, we would expect that consumers would start to pay more for things. So the CPI and the PPI should track relatively closely together, at least in how they are changing. They should both go up at the same time and generally go down at the same time or close to it. So we're going to zoom in today on the GDP deflator and the CPI. And the first thing I want you to kind of know and kind of put in your brains is that anytime you see either of these values, you immediately need to replace them with the words price. The GDP deflator is not a measure of GDP, it is a measure of prices. And the CPI is also generally a measure of prices. So when that number goes up, it means that prices are going up. And if that number goes down, it means that prices are going down. And in either case, what we can now do is we can plug these numbers into our rate of change equation. So when we say, oh, we need to compare prices over time, we can compare the GDP deflator over time, or we can compare the CPI over time, and both of those will give us an inflation rate for a broad number of goods in the economy simultaneously. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, relies on what is called a fixed basket of goods and services. So in essence, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, who calculate these numbers, went out and they have decided a basket, a shopping cart of things that people tend to buy. And they put a bunch of items in this shopping cart, and the shopping cart never changes, because we need to make sure that the only thing that changes over time in these calculations is the price level. We can't change the price level and the cart. We can only change the price level over time. So every month they actually send out thousands and thousands of people who are called purchasers for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who go out and purchase the items in the basket in order to record their prices and measure their prices over time. And they go out every single month and they try to buy the exact same items as best they can. And just for your background information, in reality, not every item is weighed the same. So as you can see in this graph, the cost of shelter, housing, what might be rent or a mortgage payment, is a large part of what people spend their money on. So it makes up a large part of the basket. Food is the next biggest thing that people spend money on, and so it's the next biggest item in the basket. but they literally go through thousands upon thousands of items, and they track each item and put each item into the basket and then weight those items appropriately based on how much of our money are going to these items, so that we can see how the basket of goods that people buy over time changes. So the number one most important thing about the CPI is that the quantity of goods in the basket never changes, so that the only thing that changes from one year to the next is price. And then ultimately what we do is, much like the GDP deflator, we measure the price of those items in the current year using current prices, and we compare that to the price of these items in the base year. And doing that gives us our price index that becomes the CPI. And then that price index is what we can put into our inflation rate equation. I know as I'm going right here, it sounds like I'm going quickly and it sounds like a lot. So the best thing to do is actually just to dive into a practice problem. So as we go in the next few slides, I'm going to give you the opportunity. I'm going to pause a few times to allow you to try to do each step along the way. And then you'll be able to go off and do several other practice problems as well. So here is our CPI practice problem. We have a basket, and the basket has in it 10 shirts, 2 concert tickets, and 1 cell phone. So this is the basket that the average consumer in this economy purchases. And then we have the price of each of these items individually in the year 2000, the year 2005, and the year 2010. So the first thing we need to do in order to slowly build up our price index and our inflation rate is we need to calculate how much the basket cost in total each year. So pause the video here in just a moment and calculate the value of the basket in each of these 3 years. What would it cost to buy 10 shirts, 2 concert tickets, and 1 cell phone in each year? Pause here and I'll come back in 5 seconds to check your work. Okay, so if you did your math appropriately here, you would have gotten that in the year 2000, the basket cost $800. In the year 2005, the basket cost $1,000. And in the year 2010, the basket cost $1,100. So that's step one. We now know how much the basket cost in each of our 3 years. So the next step is to turn these basket prices into our CPI or our indexed value. So our index, remember, takes the cost of the basket in the current year and divides it by the cost of the basket in the base year. So using a base year of 2005, pause the video here in a moment and calculate the CPI in each of these years. So remember, cost of the basket in the current year divided by cost of the basket in the base year with a base year of 2005. Pause here, do your calculations. So one more time, here are your correct answers. In 2000, we would have had $800 as the cost of the basket in 2000 divided by $1,000, the cost of the basket in 2005, and that would give you a CPI value of 80. In 2005, the base year, just like GDP deflator, in the base year, the value of this will always be 100 because we'll be dividing the value of the base year by itself. And in 2010, 1,100 divided by 1,000 will give us a CPI value of 110. So now we've converted these basket prices into CPI values, into these kind of simpler numbers based around the number 100, which help us to track which direction prices are going. The final step of our CPI calculation is to now use our CPI values to calculate the inflation rate between each year. So we take these CPI values and we plug them into our rate of change equation. And one more time, I'd like you to do 3 different calculations here. What was the inflation rate over the first 5 years, from 2000 to 2005? What was the inflation rate over the second 5 years, from 2005 to 2010? And what was the inflation rate over the full 10-year period, from 2000 to 2010? In each case, use your price index, your CPI value, to plug into our inflation rate equation. One more time, take 5 seconds. Well, I'll pause for 5 seconds. You take as much time as you need to calculate the inflation rate in each of these years. All right, if you did your math carefully, using your price index values to calculate inflation, you would come up with that in the first 5-year period, the inflation rate was 25%. 100 minus 80 divided by 80 is 25%. In the next 5-year period, the inflation rate was 10%. 10 over 100 is 10%. And over the full 10-year period, the inflation rate was 37.5%. 110 over 80 will be 30, and 30 out of 80 is 37.5. So this 3-step process is the basic process to calculating inflation using a price index. We calculate the cost of the basket each year, being sure to keep the basket itself the same. We convert our basket prices into a price index, and we use the price index to calculate the inflation rate. As our final step on this, I want to talk briefly about one of the biggest controversies related to the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is frequently seen to have 2 major flaws or 2 major problems in it. It is not perfect at calculating inflation. There is no perfect measure of inflation. And surprisingly, according to most economists, the CPI actually tends to overstate inflation, meaning that it tells us that inflation is higher than inflation actually is. Most people think the opposite. They think inflation is higher than the CPI, but the CPI tends to overstate the inflation we actually experience. And this is for 2 reasons, both of which are related to the fact that the CPI's basket never changes. The first reason is that the CPI has no way to keep up with new goods and new technologies. And so the basket struggles to show us quality improvements over time. Prices might be going up, but they are not always going up because of strictly inflation. Sometimes they are going up because the product is actually better. And in some cases, prices might go down and because the product is better and easier to produce, but the rate at which the price goes down doesn't match how much better the product is. A great example of this is a cell phone. Our cell phones today are somewhere in the range of $800 to $1,000 for something like a new iPhone or a new Android phone. That's probably in the range of 2 to 3 times what it was 20 years ago when people were using flip phones. But a modern cell phone is very obviously much more than 2 times better than a flip phone, right? It's 1,000 times better than a flip phone in terms of all of the technology inside of it. So even though the basket says prices have tripled, the value of the things in the basket has gone up substantially more than the prices in the basket themselves. The second reason that CPI is not always great at calculating inflation and capturing inflation is because of substitution. When goods tend to get expensive, people begin to change their spending habits to avoid inflation. And that means that while the CPI might be showing the inflation of certain goods, those might not be the goods that people are buying anymore. So as certain types of transportation get more expensive or certain types of computers get more expensive, people might move to buying different products, and therefore they might avoid the inflation altogether. And so the inflation that we actually experience in our wallets is not always identical to the inflation that the CPI captures. Right? Prices are going to go up, but people are not necessarily going to pay those higher prices because they might change parts of the way that they are living and operating in order to avoid those higher prices. So, as a quick review, the basic things you need to know about CPI as we end this video. Number one, CPI is calculated by using a fixed market basket of goods, and we want to track the value of that basket over time. Number two, CPI, just like the GDP deflator, is a measure of price level. When you see the letters CPI, you immediately replace them with "this is the price of a good" in a given time. If it says CPI is 120, say that means groceries cost $120 in that year, right? That means that when the CPI goes up, it means prices were higher than they were in the base year, and when CPI goes down, prices were going down. Lastly, when we calculate inflation, we are measuring the rate of change of the CPI between 2 years, right? So inflation is the rate of change of all goods in the basket simultaneously by using the CPI over the 2 years that you are comparing. So a quick review here. Your job now is to go back into some of your practice problems and some of the other resources and put them to use so that you can get familiar with what using CPI actually feels like and how using the GDP deflator is a similar process.